right, well, if you have your Bibles with you this morning, we'll be in Genesis chapter 29 and 30. We'll be reading through a lot of that, so if you have your Bibles with you, be ready to turn in the pages there, Genesis 29 and 30. And while you're turning there, I think that I was just curious, how many of you guys are on social media in some way? Raise your hand if you're on social media in any form. How many of you guys have decided to abstain from social media? You don't have to raise your hand. We can actually see the peace on your face, right? But for those of us that are still struggling with that addiction, I think that we all know that there are a lot of things that are really fun about social media. We talked just a few weeks ago about the Easter picture roast. That was always fun. The Ice Bucket Challenge. How many of you guys have participated in the Ice Bucket Challenge at some point or maybe even seen that done? How many of you guys will confess that you are addicted to reels or stories? Yeah, come on now, raise your hand. I know. I was talking to my mom. She said that my stepdad, Jeff, gets up at 4 a.m. I said, what does he do at 4 a.m.? She said, he watches reels. And I said, not forever. But anyway, we all get addicted. As a matter of fact, there's a few things I wanted to share with you, just I found funny. I thought if we ever get a church sign in Pekin, this was the church sign that I would like to use. WWJD, what would Jesus do? Well, he wouldn't be making meth, all right? That's funny, all right? This is a reel that I ran across that I thought was
Flip
fun.
right double, X jet, 36 counter naked waggle at 7, X quarter on 1.
On 1,
Flip
right?
double.
That's the end of that one. That was funny. That was my wife ordering our Starbucks order. And then I think there's one last one. It's a guy racing.
1, 2, 3.
Kevin, that guy's not even racing you.
Yeah, he did. He blinked.
His wife said, he's not racing you. He said, yes, he did. He blinked. And so some of you are like, what are these reels? I need to get into those, right? No, it is a trap. You may not be into reels, but some of you are social sleuths. You see someone that maybe doesn't have pictures with their significant other anymore, and you've got to dive in and see what's really going on. Some of you are really good at passive aggression or guessing who the passive aggression is being directed toward in other people's posts. So we get fed up with people's humble brags and keyboard warriors and things like that. There's a lot of fun and good things, a lot of entertainment out there on social media. But I think it's easy to see that social media has brought up a lot of issues in a lot of people's lives as well. They've made a very negative impact on our society. As a matter of fact, they say that there's been an incredible increase in cyberbullying and harassment because of them. There's been problems with addiction and compulsive use of social media. How many of you have noticed a decreased attention span, right? You can only pay attention for the length of a gnat that can pay attention to, right? We struggle with decreased attention spans. Anxiety and depression seem to be on the rise. Content exposure to idealized versions of others' lives can lead to feelings of inadequacy in our lives. Social media can have a lot of negative impacts. It tends to bring up or bring to light our temptation to compare ourselves to others. When you get into the New Testament, 2 Corinthians 10, Paul is writing to the church at Corinth, and he tells them, those that compare themselves among themselves are not wise. It's not a wise thing to do. It's not wise because what happens is people put their highlight reels on social media, and we go on there and we watch their highlight reels, and we compare their highlight reel to our behind the scenes. We look at everything that's just right and everything that's great for them, and then we look at our lives and go, but my life's not like that. These kinds of things lead us to believe that I'm not enough. I always fail. I am unlovable. I am not blessed. It leads us to the place where we wonder, what do I have to do to get that kind of blessing on my life? What do I have to do to have that kind of love in my life? What do I need to do to get what they have? These kinds of thoughts leave us hungering for validation. In my older days, I would have had a little bit more brash response to someone talking about a hunger for validation. I would have said, suck it up, buttercup. Life is rough, get a helmet, you'll be fine, Like, that's the way I typically would look at it. But I think as we begin to really look at these things in our lives and the lives of others, I think the title of our sermon series really hits the nail on the head. The struggle is real. When it comes to these kinds of things, the struggle is real. These kinds of thoughts, these kinds of memories cause real pain. They cause real hurts. And what's important to know is those hurts and those pains can lead to real danger. And if that's you today, if you are struggling with the lack of love, or struggling with rejection, or struggling with disappointment, I have good news for you, and that is the subtitle of our series. God wants to meet you in the middle of that. God wants to meet you right where you are, where you're longing for something you can't seem to obtain or can't seem to get. So for today, we're going to be addressing two groups of people, and it's these two groups right here. We're going to address those that feel rejected and those that feel disappointed. You may be at a point right now where you're thinking, Josh, if you knew my past, if you knew my struggle with addiction, if you knew what I've done to receive validation, if you knew what was running through my mind, both the things I've done and the things that have been done to me, you'd put me on Jerry Springer if it was still on the air. That's what would happen if you knew. And I got good news for you, that you are in good company. We are looking over the last several weeks at the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. I love that God put people in the scriptures that had just as jacked up stories as many of us have. We won't take time to go back and look at everything that happened in his life. You can go back and listen to those on the podcast or on the website. But he has deceived his brother into giving him his birthright, and he has stolen his brother's blessing. And now he is leaving from his angry older brother who wants to kill him, and he's going at his mother's behest to Padanaram, which is a city where his uncle Laban lives. And his mom has told him, when you get there, don't marry any of those Padamaranites or Padamaranians or whatever they called them. You need to marry one of your uncle's daughters. Some of you are like, that sounds a lot like kissing cousins. You're right, but that had not been outlawed yet through the law. That's a whole other story. If you have questions about that, talk to my mom afterwards. She'll explain it. All right? Let's pick up in chapter 29 and verse number 1. Chapter 29 and verse 1, it says, Then Jacob went on his journey. He came into the land of the people of the east, and he looked, and behold, a well in the field. And lo, there were flocks of sheep. There were flocks of sheep lying by it. For out of that well they watered the flocks, and a great stone was upon the well's mouth. This is interesting. It's a big old stone that's on top of it. And thither were all the flocks gathered, and they rolled the stone from the well's mouth, and they watered the sheep, and then they put the stone back on the well's mouth in its place. And Jacob comes unto him. He says, My brethren, where are you from? And they said, We're of Haran. Of Haran are we? And he said unto them, Do you know Laban, the son of Nahor? And they're like, We know him. I don't know if it was like, yeah, we know him, or if it was like, oh yeah, we know him. You know, we don't know. But they knew him. And he said unto them, Is he well? That's kind of funny. They're standing at a well, and he asked, Is he well? Dads, come on, help me out. That's a dad joke, right? Is he well? And behold, and they said, He is well. And behold, Rachel, his daughter, cometh with the sheep. So they said, yeah, he's doing well. As a matter of fact, here's his daughter, Rachel, that's coming along. And in his mind, he's thinking, I was told that when I get there, I'm supposed to marry one of his daughters. And so here comes a prospective bride to him, right? And so I don't know if on the way there, he was like, I don't know how many daughters Laban has, but if I got to marry one of them, I hope one of them's good looking, right? I hope one of them's got a good personality. And maybe he was dreading it, like, seriously, I don't want to have to marry one of my cousins, you know? And I don't know exactly what was going on in his mind at this time, but it tells us there in verse number, whatever that verse was, verse number 6, that Rachel was coming with the sheep. It says in verse 7, and he said, Lo, it is yet high day, neither is it time that the cattle should be gathered together. Water ye the sheep, and go and feed them. And they said, Well, we can't until all the flocks be gathered together, until they roll the stone from the well's mouth, then we'll water the sheep. Some people believe this stone was so large that they had to get all the sheep together so that they could have all the shepherds together so that they could move this large stone because it was so heavy and difficult to move. Verse number 9 says, And while he yet spake with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, and she kept them. And it came to pass that when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, that Jacob went near and rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. Now, maybe I'm just reading a little bit too much into this, but they were like, we can't move the stone because it's heavy and we got to get all these shepherds here to help us do it. In walks Rachel. You're going to see pretty soon, Rachel's smoking hot, all right? I'm sorry, it's how it's said there, all right? And so when he moves the stone, this is the equivalent of a teenager in a youth group trying to impress another young lady, and he's carrying like 4 chairs under each arm. You guys know what I'm talking about, trying to impress them. This is the equivalent of a man walking by a good-looking girl, going, excuse me, where's the weight room? You know, kind of doing one of those. That's kind of how Jake got Avery down here, all right? But, oh, just kidding. I couldn't help it. Jake's just, anyway, moving on. And so we see that he's trying to impress this young lady, right? And he now goes to her house. He meets Laban and starts working for Laban. He's a month into this whole thing, and I think he hasn't talked about wages because he is just smitten with Rachel. Look what it says in verse number 15. And Laban said unto Jacob, because thou art my brother, shouldest thou therefore serve me for naught? In other words, you're going to work for free? He says, tell me, what shall your wages be? And Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the elder was Leah. The name of the younger was Rachel. Leah was tender-eyed, but Rachel was beautiful and well-favored. Now, there's a contrast between these two. It doesn't take a mental heavyweight to see the contrast that's taking place here. Leah was the older one, and she was tender-eyed. Now, when it says that she was tender-eyed, some people believe that this meant that she had a gentle, kind, sensitive look to her eyes, possibly indicating that she had a quiet inward beauty and a very gracious disposition. Some people are not so kind. Some people believe that when it says that she was tender-eyed, it meant that she had weak eyes, which means that some people believe that she was either lazy-eyed or cross-eyed. And so either way, it doesn't matter, because at the end of the verse it says, but, what does it say? Not the same with Rachel. Rachel was beautiful and well-favored. In the Greek, it literally means smoking hot, all right? If you look at it, that is what it means. Another way of saying this, it literally is saying she was beautiful in form and appearance. It's not only referring here to the beauty of her face, but also of her figure. She was all-encompassing, a beautiful woman. So essentially, it says, Rachel is wow. And Leah has tender eyes. It's the equivalent of saying, yeah, Rachel's really good looking, and Leah, she's got a great personality, you know. That's what we see taking place in these verses. We laugh about that, but could you imagine what this kind of comparison was doing in the heart of Leah? I believe she had to be wrestling with insecurity, this lack of confidence, this lack of assurance, this self-doubt that she had. When something is secure, it means it's firmly established. It means that it is in very safe keeping. If something is, the prefix in means the opposite of. So she was the opposite of feeling safe. She was the opposite of feeling established or secure. This is how Leah lived. She lived under this constant comparison to this beautiful younger sister. And the sad truth is that there's many believers that live in the same place of self-doubt and insecurity. It may be something about your appearance. It may be something about your financial status. It may be something about your relationship status or your inability to accomplish something, or it may have something to do with something physical, emotional, financial, whatever it may be. It leaves us living in this state of less than. When we're compared to someone else, we are not enough. Look what happens in verse 18. It says, and Jacob loved Rachel. And this is what he said when he said, what shall I pay you? He says, I will serve you for 7 years for Rachel, the younger daughter. I'll serve you 7 years. And Laban said, it's better that I give her to thee than I should give her to another man. Abide with me. And so Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed unto him but a few days for the love that he had for her. Well, that's a pretty loving statement that it's making about the love that he had for her. But we see the reality in verse 21 where it says, Jacob said to Leah, give me thy wife, for my days are fulfilled, that I might go in unto her. I'm not going to beat around the bush here. He says, I want to lay with her, is what he's saying. In verse 22, it says, and Laban gathered together all the men of the place and made a feast, and it came to pass in the evening, and he took Leah, his daughter, and brought her to Jacob. And Jacob went in unto Leah. That wasn't the deal. He loved Rachel, and he was supposed to give, Laban was supposed to give Rachel to him. And when it says here that they went to a feast, it's not defined here exactly what happened to that feast, but it was their custom at those feasts. They would do a lot of not only eating, but they would do a lot of drinking. And possibly Jacob at this point was drunk. Personally, I think he had to be drunk to be marrying someone that he thought was someone else, to the point to where they actually come in and they consummate the marriage. And in the next verse, it tells us that, it says in verse 24 that Laban gave unto his daughter Leah Zilpah his maid for a handmaid. We'll talk about her later. And it came to pass that in the morning, behold, it was Leah. He woke up, and there's Leah with her tender eyes, you know. He looked over, and it wasn't the good-looking one. It was the one with the good personality. And it says that he went to Laban. He says, "What have you done unto me? Did not I serve thee for Rachel? Wherefore then hast thou beguiled me?" And Laban said, "It must not be so." He's playing like he's not a deceiver here. "It must not be so in our country to give the younger before the firstborn." I've always had my attention drawn here toward Jacob and Laban, and it's very easy to see how our attention can go to them, because we've spent the last 3 weeks talking about how Jacob was a deceiver, right? And now the deceiver becomes the deceived. We see that what we read in the New Testament was true in the Old Testament as well. "Be not deceived, God is not mocked, for whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap." And now he's reaping what he's sown by being deceived after he had been a deceiver. But the emphasis of this passage does not seem to be on Jacob as much as it seems to be upon Leah and her sister. Leah had lived under the shadow of her younger, better-looking sister, and now her husband. She's married him, even though it was under false pretenses. She obviously wanted to be with him. Her husband looks at her, and he essentially says in the morning, "I don't want her." She had lived her whole life under the shadow of her sister, and in her mind, she always thought that people were thinking that. She always thought people are always comparing me to Rachel, and in her mind, she always thought that others would always pick her, but now she's not, or pick Rachel, but now she's not thinking it, she's hearing someone say it out loud. "I don't want you." On top of that, her own father used her. He could have been straight up about their customs 7 years earlier, right? He could have been straight up with Jacob and said, "I'll tell you what, you got to marry Leah. How about a 2-for-1 deal? All right, let's talk about this." He could have been straight up, but he didn't do that. So this confirmed in Leah's heart that even her father thought she wasn't enough, because had he been straight up, then he knew that Jacob wouldn't have wanted Leah in the first place. If you found yourself feeling this kind of rejection, this is not something that can be pushed down. It's not something that is going to work itself out someday. Well, actually, it is something that'll work itself out someday, but it'll work itself out in a very negative and dangerous way, in a way that you wish it would not. But before we see how it played itself out in Leah's life, look what else happened in verse number 27. Chapter 29 and verse 27 says, and let's see here. It says, "Fulfill her week." So this is Laban's response to Jacob after Jacob said, "I wanted to marry Rachel, not Leah." He says, "Fulfill her week." Now, when it talks about a week here, their custom was when someone got married, there would be a week of celebration, 7 days of celebration. He says, "Let's just get through this wedding week celebration, and then I'll give you this also for the service which you'll serve me with yet 7 other years." And Jacob did so, and he fulfilled her week and gave him Rachel, his daughter, to wife also. This was interesting to me as I read this. I actually had someone mention this to me after the service last week. I've always thought that he worked 7 years and then got Leah, and he worked 7 more years and then got Rachel, but that's not what it says here. It says that he worked 7 years, got Leah, they went through the 7-day wedding celebration, and after the 7 days, then he got Rachel, but it was on credit. He had to work for 7 years to fulfill the commitment. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the significance of what we see here. But when we think about this, he's married to Leah, 7 days later, he's slept with Leah. 7 days later, now he marries Rachel. I'm not even going to pretend that I understand how the rest of this played out practically. Jacob now has 2 wives that are sisters. Whew, imagine that. He loved one of them more than the other, but he's still having a sexual relationship with both of them. And here's where it gets interesting. Look what it says in chapter 29, in verse number 31. And when the Lord saw that Leah was hated, which when you're not receiving love, when you're not feeling love, as a matter of fact, husbands, our primary responsibility is to make sure that our wives feel love. That's why in Ephesians 5 it says, husbands, love your wives. She did not feel that love, and when a wife does not feel loved, it can feel like hatred. And it says that the Lord saw that she was wrestling with this, and so he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. She wasn't able to have children. The next verse it says, and Leah conceived and bare a son, and she called his name Reuben. For she said, surely the Lord hath looked upon my affliction. Now therefore my husband will love me. I mean, can you feel the pain and the emotion that is in what she named her child here? She has a child with this man that doesn't love her like he loves her sister. And she says, I'm going to name him Reuben, because in naming him Reuben, this is a picture. The name literally means God has seen me. And hopefully that'll mean that now my husband will love me. She ends up having another son. His name is Simeon. And Simeon means God has heard. So God has seen me. God has heard me. She has another son. All the while, Rachel hasn't had any. There's a lot of names going on here, all right? I'm sure if you noticed that or not. Leah has another one, and it's named Levi, and Levi means to be joined or attached to. And she hoped that that would be symbolic of now my husband will be joined or attached to me. And she has one more son, and his name is Judah, which Judah means praise or praised. And so essentially, what we see here is that Leah does what we tend to do when we struggle with disappointment. Leah does what we tend to do when we struggle with rejection. She started by attempting to control the situation. Number one, it was, we're going to have kids, right? Number two, I'm going to name them creatively to not only show what's happening, not only show what my hope is, but hopefully get a message across to my husband. And number three, once I have these kids, I name them creatively, then my husband's going to love me. Just imagine when she's calling these kids in for dinner. I don't know if sometimes she would refer to them by their meaning rather than their name, but if she did, she could say, God has been with me, come to dinner. God has heard me, come to dinner. God has attached himself to me. Hopefully my husband will too. And praise the Lord, come to dinner. I can kind of imagine that these names were intended to get the attention of Jacob and maybe even be a little bit of a dig towards her sister Rachel. But here's what we do know. Her attempts to control the situation did not change the situation. And the same thing is true for us. Our labor, our attempts to gain love and acceptance will not work either. As a matter of fact, it makes things worse. In her attempt to control the situation, and in her attempt to earn love, in her attempt to earn acceptance, she missed that what she wanted, she already had. In her attempts to get what she thought she wanted, she missed that what she wanted she already had. As a matter of fact, I heard one person say the fastest way to kill something special is to compare it to something else. The fastest way to kill something special is to compare it to something else, rather than embracing the fact that she had been given 4 children. And in their day, to be given 4 sons was very significant. She's still measuring herself up against Rachel. She's not embracing what God had given her. What she wanted, she already had. The only reason she was able to have those children in the first place was because the Lord saw her in verse 31 and opened her womb. God sees people that are rejected. God sees people that struggle with feeling unloved. God, as one person said, selects what man rejects. And so if you are an unloved Leah today, If you know the pain of being unwanted, if you grew up without a parent, or you know the pain of a broken marriage, or if you've been ostracized by others, or you don't get invited to parties, or you don't get a seat at the table, or you're the one that doesn't get asked out, I want you to remember that when Jacob didn't want Leah, God said, I want Leah. This is revolutionary because what we think is we've got to get their acceptance and we've got to get their love. And God says, forget about them. You have it in me. He said, I see you and I see your pain. When we don't recognize this, we do stupid things to gain acceptance. When the truth of the matter is we are accepted. And when we believe this, it saves us from the impossible task of attempting to control the love and acceptance of others. You do realize that, right? Like, you don't have the power to force someone to love you. You don't have the power to force someone to accept you. And that's why my hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and His righteousness. Our hope is not in the acceptance of man. Our hope is in the acceptance of God. Look what it says in chapter 30 and verse number 1. It says, and when Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister and said unto Jacob, give me children, or else I die. Leah wasn't the only one that was struggling with this. She wasn't the only one struggling with rejection and insecurity in this story. Rachel has it all on the outside. Right? And isn't that true? A lot of times when people have it all on the outside, a lot of times they're quivering on the inside and they're hurting on the inside. She had it all on the outside, but she was struggling inwardly. She had the approval, but she did not have the achievement. Right? She wasn't able to have the kids. But the truth is that both of the sisters were miserable because all of us are drawn to see what we don't have. Here's Leah, who is having babies, but she was longing for acceptance. And then you look at Rachel, and she has acceptance, but she's longing for babies. And God wanted both of them to look to Him rather than man. It says that when Rachel was comparing herself, we saw comparing ourselves among ourselves is not wise. When Rachel compared herself to Leah, it led to her envying her sister. She resented that God had been good in someone else's life. And she believed that someone else's life was better than hers. I think that's something that many of us have probably struggled with at some point, where we have looked at someone else's life and thought, why is God so good to them and He hasn't been that good to me? When we struggle with envy, it demands that we stop counting our blessings. It requires a blind eye to God's goodness to us. It forgets about grace, and it questions God's justice and questions God's generosity. Rachel here ends up doing exactly what Leah did. And if we were honest, it's exactly what we tend to do. She attempted to control the situation. Look what happens in verse number 3. You thought it was weird. Listen, it says, and she said, behold, my maid, my servant, Bilhah, go in unto her, and she will bear upon my knees that I may also have children by her. And she gave him Bilhah, her handmaid, to wife, and Jacob was like, okay. Jacob was a messed up guy, right? He's got two wives, and now he's going in unto the servant of his other wife. And look what it says in verse 6. It says, and Rachel said, God hath judged me, and hath also heard my voice, and hath given me a son. Therefore called she his name Dan. What we see here is that her handmaid has a son, and they name him Dan. Bilhah ends up having another son, and his name is Naphtali. And then Leah, because they're constantly comparing amongst one another because of the lack of acceptance, because of the lack of performance, the lack of peace and contentment in the Lord. Look what Leah decided she had to keep up. So in verse 9 it says, when Leah saw that she had left bearing, she wasn't able to have kids now, she took Zilpah, her maid, and gave her to Jacob to wife. And Zilpah, Leah's maid, bare Jacob a son. And Leah said, a troop cometh, and she called his name Gad. So now they're having all these kids. I mean, I have time to read all these stories. I mean, it's crazy. You've got Gad and Asher that are both born from Zilpah, this maid. Verse 14 it says, and Reuben went in the days of wheat harvest and found some mandrakes, a plant that was valuable in the field, and brought them unto his mother Leah. And Rachel said to Leah, can I have some of those mandrakes? And you almost hear echoes of Esau. Because remember what Esau said, you stole my birthright, and now you want to steal my blessing? Look what he says in verse 15. And she said unto her, is it a small matter that you have taken my husband, and now you want to take my son's mandrakes also? I mean, you talk about drama going on. And Rachel said, therefore, well, I got a deal for you. He'll lay with you tonight for your son's mandrakes. Is this bizarre to anyone else? Like, if you've never heard this story before, if this is your first time in church, they're not all this crazy, all right? And it says in verse number 16 that Jacob came out of the field, and Leah went out to meet him and said, you got to come in unto me tonight, for surely I have hired thee with my son's mandrakes. And he was like, okay, right? Just wild. Verse 17, God hearkened unto Leah, and she conceived. After not being able to have children, now she has another one, and she bare Jacob a fifth son. She ends up having a sixth son, and look at what she says in verse number 20. And Leah said, God hath endued me with a good dowry. Now will my husband dwell with me, because I have borne him 6 sons. And she called his name Zebulun. After all these kids, she hasn't realized that there was no success. There was no accomplishment that could satisfy her insecurity. Because the problem was not a lack of performance. The problem was not a lack of success. The problem was that she was trying to fill a void that only God can fill with something else, with someone else. Look what it says in verse 22. It says, and God remembered Rachel, and God hearkened to her and opened her womb. So now Rachel gets in on the dance, right? And Rachel is now finally able to have a son, and she gives birth to a son that you've probably heard of. His name is Joseph. You guys remember Joseph? We'll hear more about him later on. But in all, there will be 12 sons that are born to Jacob through these 4 women. And the sad thing about this story is that there's no closure. The Bible doesn't tell us that there was ever a solution. We're not told how or when Leah died. We're actually told how Rachel died. Rachel actually gets pregnant again, and she passes away while she's giving birth to her second son, which would be Jacob's 12th son, Benjamin. There's no closure. In our lives, the pain of rejection and the pain of disappointment will have the same conclusion, the lack of closure. It'll have the same conclusion if we follow the same pattern. If we follow this same pattern of comparing ourselves among ourselves, the same pattern of envy, the same pattern of trying to earn favor or trying to earn acceptance in our own power, we have to understand that drastic change requires drastic change, and that change does not come from others, it comes in us. We cannot control them anyway. So here's what we can do if we are in a situation. Rather than trying to take over on our own, the first thing that we need to do if we're struggling with rejection or disappointment is this: we need to look to Jesus. We need to look to God. You can't run your race while you're looking at someone else. This is kind of something that runs in our family. My brother Jim, I don't think I see him this morning, but Jim, when he was in high school, was kind of a bigger guy, and the football coach came up to him and he said, hey, would you be interested in playing football? And Jim said, well, do you have to run? And the coach said, yes. And he said, well, I'm not interested. And that's kind of how I feel as well. Like, I'm not running. The Bible says the wicked flee when no man pursueth, right? And so I don't really want to run. But one thing I learned when I was, I think, in 8th grade PE, when they made us do track, they said, when you're running, you can't be looking to the side. You need to be looking at where you're headed, right? When you're playing softball or baseball, you teach someone, when you get a hit, you don't look at the shortstop, or you don't look at whoever's fielding the ball. You look at first base, and you run through the bag. You run all the way as hard as you can. And the same thing is true spiritually. You can't run your race while you're watching someone else. Rather than comparing ourselves among ourselves, we look to Jesus. When we look sideways, it prevents us from fulfilling our unique purpose. And so I want to encourage you this morning, if you're feeling rejected or if you're feeling disappointed, look to Jesus. Which kind of like last week, talking about going back to Bethel, that's kind of one of those phrases that's like, look to Jesus. What does that mean? Can I give you a few practical things that will help us to see what it means? Number one, trust that His plan for you is enough. What does it mean to look to Jesus? It means I'm going to trust that He has a plan for me, and it is enough. God made you. He called you as you are. Stop comparing and start embracing the God of Psalm 139 that says, I will praise Thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are Thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well. Do you believe that? That God made you unique as you are, and your experiences God has allowed? We need to accept that God's plan for us is enough. That's what it means to look to Jesus. The second thing is this: believe that you are loved by Him. To truly believe that God loves you. I mean, do we have to look any further than the cross? For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son. My son's sitting back there, and I'm not giving him up for any of you guys. I'm sorry, but I love you, but I love him more. He's excited. Yes, he's excited about that I'm not giving him up. But God gave His only begotten Son. He proved it to us. That His Son would go to the cross for our sins so that we could be reunited with God. We were broken because of our sin, but we can be forgiven through believing that Jesus Christ died for us, was buried, and rose again, and simply believing the gospel of Jesus Christ. Believe that we are loved by Him. I love what Psalm 139 continues in verse number 17. It says this: how precious also are Thy thoughts unto me, O God. How great is the sum of them? Do you ever stop and think about that? That God stops to think about you? Is that verse true? You could put your name in there. How precious are God's thoughts to you? As a matter of fact, the next verse, I didn't put it in here, but it says that they're more than the sands of the sea. That God thinks about you. We don't think about God in those terms. We think He's busy, He's doing this, but He's thinking. The Bible talks about how the hairs of our head are numbered. So for some of you, God thinks about you a lot because He's having to keep track of. Come on, roll with me here, guys, all right? You are loved by God. Lastly, meditate upon His blessings. On what you do have rather than what you don't have. Realizing that every good gift and every perfect gift is from above. Rather than taking inventory of everything that's wrong in your world, take inventory of everything that is right in your world. Look at Him looking at you in love. He's looking at you with a plan that He has already had before you were even formed in the womb. Looking at you with love and looking at you with blessings. I want to conclude by sharing a small detail that we passed over in chapter 29 and verse 11. In chapter 29 and verse number 11, it says this, that Jacob kissed Rachel. And now that's not weird. Like the first time that he met her, he was like, come here. It wasn't anything like that. It was customary, like kiss him on the cheek kind of a thing. He kissed Rachel and he lifted up his voice and wept. When I read that, I wondered, why would Jacob cry? He was sitting at a well with these other shepherds. I mean, he was a man's man. I mean, he was a deceiver. He was tough. Why would he cry at this point? We have to step back into his story and understand that Jacob left his family in utter disappointment. Not only by his own decisions, not only was he disappointed by his own decisions, but he had been rejected by his own father. His father didn't love him like he loved his brother Esau. He's full of shame. He's full of regret. Even though his dad told him, God's still got a plan for you. He's like, yeah, whatever. And then God gives him the dream in chapter 28, and God's like, I'm going to bless you. And I'm sure in the back of his mind, he's going, that's not how my life goes. I am just a big disappointment, not only to myself, but to others. People have rejected me, and he's walking away from all of this, and now he's in a new land, not sure if he'll get more of the same. And God puts this beautiful woman in front of him. And he knows that this woman is going to be his wife. And his tears were simply an overflow of a heart that recognized the hand of God upon him. Even while he was in exile, even when he was running, he was seeing that God did have a plan, and that God did still love him, and that God was still blessing him. There are times in our lives where we're struggling with rejection and disappointment, where we just need to step back and see what God has been doing and what he plans on doing. As I was preparing for this morning, I didn't plan to include this, but I wanted to share it. It's a picture of my daughter. Emma graduated from college yesterday. And so I was thinking about this story and comparing it to her story. Emma's life has been one that's been filled with a lot of disappointment. And I think my mom asked me, she said, do you think tomorrow, she was on Friday, she said, do you think tomorrow's going to be as emotional as Emma's recital was? And I said, nah, it won't be very emotional. And then she put on that robe right there in that spot, and then she put on those beads that most of you probably didn't even notice. But a couple of weeks ago, she sent an email to her neurologist and said, is there a way that you can look at my records and see how many seizures that I've had since I've been in college? And they gave her the number. And she made a chain of beads that each bead represents a seizure that she had while she was in college. And then on the sash, you can't see it, but it says, my God is bigger than epilepsy. On her cap that you can't see, it says, there's nothing my God cannot do. And I can't help but think that here's Jacob, who is just broken with rejection. He's broken with disappointment, and life just hasn't gone the way we thought it would go. And then he gets to this point, and he sees God's been at work the whole time. And I think that's why Jacob cried. The daughters didn't get a chance to see it, but Leah and Rachel also got a chance. We get a chance to see how God worked through their lives. Their 12 sons would become the 12 tribes of Israel. Their son, Rachel's son, Joseph, would be used to save that family. Through that family, the world would be blessed. And if you go to Matthew chapter 1 and you read the genealogy of our Messiah, Jesus Christ, it says that Jesus was born of the tribe, anybody know? Of Judah. Not of the tribe of one of the sons of of Rachel. Judah was born of the one that was rejected. Judah was born of the one that lived in disappointment. And God said, I still have a plan through that. So if you're wrestling with any of those things today, I want you to be reminded of what we said last week, and that is that we need to remember that God is with us. And this week, we need to remember that God is for us. He does have a plan. He does love us, and he is blessing, especially during these times of rejection and disappointment. Let's pray together.